So Francesco Ronchi is administrator at the Directorate for Democracy Support of the European Parliament. He has been Deputy Chief of Staff in the Office of the President of Socialists and Democratic Group in the European Parliament. And from 2011 to 2012, he served the United Nations as an electoral advisor in the peacebuilding mission in Ivory Coast. He is an adjunct professor at Sciences Po, where he teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses, and he's a regular commentator on European affairs for venues including Le Figaro and the Wall Street Journal. So it's a great pleasure to have him here today. Francesco will be talking about democracy support in the Balkans. So without further ado, I leave the word to Francesco. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Carlo. I would like to thank Carlo and the European Institute of Columbia University for this invitation. I have to specify that today I will speak in a personal capacity, of course, and not on behalf of my institution. It goes without saying. I also understand that it is a special day for America's democracy, and our minds are in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, rather than in Europe or in Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Albania. But I also believe that what we will discuss today has something to do also with the future of democracy in America and in the West. I will go the long way around to come to the Balkans. And I will start with my experience, why I ended up working on democracy in the Western Balkans. I have been working for most of my career in Western European politics. So not Western Balkan, but Western European politics. And in the last years, I experienced personally some of the biggest political developments in Europe. The Brexit referendum in 2016, the collapse of the social democracy, which is one of the pillars of European democracy in several countries, the rise of populism and far right in many countries, and the end of historical and traditional political organizations. In other terms, I think that I have experienced in my personal professional career what has been defined as the crisis of liberal democracy, to use a very popular term of discussion in academia and politics. And my interpretation, based on my experience, was that European liberal democracy has experienced an implosion of the system and not just an attack waged by anti-liberal insurgents. And in this regard, I believe that in order to make sense of the extraordinary changes we have experienced, and I mentioned some of them, perhaps we should also add the election of Donald Trump in 2016, but I didn't experience it personally, but I think that it's part of the picture, it's part of the erosion of our liberal democratic system. I do believe that in order to make sense of these changes, we need a critical self-reflection. The list of mistakes of the European liberal establishment is huge. Support to a model of capitalism that has increased inequalities, capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich, we can say. Globalization, which is a political choice, and as political choice has weakened our communities and exposed them to populism. And even when you focus on representative democracy, we see that it has been undermined by internal changes, such as the demise of political parties and the marginalization of parliament. This tendency towards self-criticism, this focus on the establishment responsibilities rather than on the external causes of this erosion of liberal democracy, in my opinion, reflect something deep in European political history. The crucial political event of Western Europe is the collapse of the liberal regimes in the 20s and 30s of the last centuries. And as you know, the rise of the Nazi regime, of fascism in Italy and authoritarians sparked soul-searching in an entire generation of Europeans. And this soul-searching exercise still reverberates today. I was listening to the former ambassador of France, Gérard Araud, some minutes ago. He was commenting on the US presidential electoral campaign, and he was mentioning May 1940, the French defeat against the Nazis. And one of the most powerful interpretations of those crucial events 90 years ago is that the collapse of liberal regimes was more the result of the weaknesses of the European liberal structure rather than the result of the inner force of authoritarians. In Italy, this interpretation was put forward by Piero Gobetti, and this idea that fascism was the autobiography of the country. If you think of Germany, you will remember Bertolt Brecht play The Resistible Rise of Arthur Louis, which describes the resistible, not the irresistible, the resistible rise of Hitler in Germany. But perhaps the most influential interpretation of the defeat of liberal regimes in the 30s is linked to the concept of strange defeat, l'étrange défaite, developed in 1941 by the French historian Marc Bloch. According to Bloch, as you know, the French defeat against the Nazis in 1940 was not simply due to the superiority of the Nazi army and regime. This is why it's strange, it's étrange. The French establishment lacked the intellectual and moral preparedness to face the new enemy. So liberalism in France was defeated by its own cultural limit. And I believe that our approach to the democratic erosion we are experiencing in Europe is also shaped by this intellectual legacy. We tend to see the backsliding of our liberal democratic systems as the result of some mistakes or internal weaknesses, as I said. We see our weaknesses, the liberal weaknesses, but not other strengths. This interpretation, based on the idea of a strange defeat, of étrange défaite, in my opinion, has still its validity, but it also suffers from a Western Eurocentric approach that is partial and brings us far from a comprehensive understanding of the big challenges democracy is globally facing. My understanding is that in order to make sense of the evolution of democracy, and I would say even in a more normative tone, in order to defend democracy in the West, we need to understand what is happening outside the borders of the West, outside the borders of the European Union. And here comes the Balkans, and as you will see. If we zoom out from the European Union and we analyze the state of democracy at the borders of the European Union, we realize that the European Union is now mostly bordered by non-democratic regimes. Turkey, Russia, Belarus, somehow Ukraine, Serbia in the Balkans. And I would like to make two reflections on it. The first one is that Europe is not an island and cannot give up to exceptionalism. In order to protect Europe's democracy, we need to support democracy at its borders. This is an analytical remark when we look at the map of Europe. The second remark is that countries such as Turkey, Russia, Belarus, Moldova, and the Western Balkans have known only limited forms of liberal democracy. Russia, let's say in the 90s, Turkey has always been a limited democracy with a big role for the army. In these countries, the consolidation of non-democratic authoritarian regimes contradicts, at least partially, the idea of a strange defeat of democracy. The idea, we say, that the erosion of democracy is the result of the mistakes of the Democrats, of the liberal Democrats, rather than the result of the insurgency, of the strength of the insurgency of the authoritarians. These political systems that are today at the borders of Europe have never experienced forms of consolidated democracy, and some of them have been only marginally affected by the third wave of democratization in the 90s. In this context, in my opinion, we can fully understand the importance of the Balkans to analyze and to understand the changes in our democratic systems. While other countries in Central and Eastern Europe were experiencing a first limited democratization in the 90s, the countries of the Balkans were lagging behind. The Balkan Wars, civil unrest in Albania in the 90s, froze the democratic development of the region. And unlike other transitional democratic countries, such as Poland, and I would also add Hungary, a democratic establishment never really existed in these countries. So my first assumption is that the weaknesses of the democratic system in these countries, in the Balkans, has more to do with the strength of the authoritarian model, with the inner force of authoritarianism, than with the mistakes of democracy. The Balkan region, and when I say the Balkan region, I refer to the countries that were belonging to Yugoslavia, to former Yugoslavia. So Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, and Montenegro, plus Albania, which was not part of ex-Yugoslavia. So for me, these are the Western Balkans in a political definition developed by the European Union. The Western Balkans are an important case study to gauge the strength of the authoritarian model. This region is particularly relevant for Europe. First of all, because it's Europe. Historically, as you know, it has always been integrated into the European system. It has been at the crossroads between the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Venetian Republic. The region has also been the field of some of the most relevant pages of European politics, contemporary politics. The ethnic wars in the 90s, for example, where for the first time, as you know, since the end of the Second World War, genocide resurfaced in Europe. But the region has also spotted some important political trends. Identity politics, for example, didn't enter Europe, Western Europe, through America, through the US, but through the Balkans. Anders Breivik, I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Anders Breivik, the far-right extremist that killed 77 people in Utøya in 2011 in Norway, in the worst far-right attack in the history of contemporary Europe. Well, this murder, this extremist, far-right extremist, has openly taken his concept of white identity from Serb nationalism in the 90s. And in the 90s in Bosnia, Muslims were dehumanized. So the Western Balkans politically play a role that we should not underestimate, in particular due to the legacy of the Balkan wars, of the ethnic wars in the 90s. But the importance of the 90s for the Balkans has, however, limited our approach to the region. A cliché of the region, focusing only on nationalism, has prevented parts of the international community to see how the region, and in particular its political systems, have changed in the past years. And in order to overcome this very traditional, this static vision of the Balkans as the country of nationalism, as the country of civil unrest, I would like to focus on four major trends that have an impact on democracy in the region, in my opinion. Of course, there is nationalism, but I also believe that demography, organized crime, and attacks on media pluralism play a crucial role to understand what's happening in the Western Balkans. Demography, I said, plays a crucial role in shaping the political systems of the region. The president of North Macedonia, Pendarovski, has recently stated that the main threat for the region in the 90s was nationalism, while today it is demography. More and more people are leaving, are abandoning the region. By 2050, Bosnia could lose 30% of its population in 1989. Serbia and Croatia could lose 25% of its population in 1989. Albania, 18%. Entire regions have become a demographic desert. And what is striking is that these are the regions that were the most contested in the war. So basically, they did ethnic cleansing. They fought for regions that have become a desert. Serbia, for example, today, with a population of 7 million inhabitants, every year is losing 50,000 inhabitants. So 50,000 inhabitants is a mid-sized town. People are leaving the region. And the very recent research by Carlo shown that about 46% of people in Serbia, young people aged between 15 and 29 years old, want to leave their country with no intention of returning. 27% of those young people with higher education express the wish to leave their country, in this case Serbia, permanently. The reasons of this depopulation are, of course, economic. Unemployment is very high. Economic growth is not enough to correct the imbalances and to shore up further growth. But they're also political and symbolic. Because of corruption, young people believe that there is no future for them in their country. And these demographic trends could have a very negative impact on democracy in the region. They could spark illiberal reactions in particular. The current illiberal turn in the region, in my opinion, is deeply rooted in the outflow of people, especially, as we said, young people from the region, and the demographic anxieties that this, let's say, expatriation of the future has left behind. Ivan Krastev, a Bulgarian political scientist, in his latest book, has written a lot about that. He has analyzed the impact of demography, in particular in Hungary and in Poland and in other European Union, Central and Eastern European Union states, but I think that it also applies to the Balkans, to the Western Balkans. And what he says is that ethnocentric policies in the region are an example of what psychologists call displacement. What is a displacement is a defense mechanism by which minds hide an unacceptable threat and replace it with one easier to manage. Anxiety in these countries, in Serbia in particular, about non-existent immigrants that are about to overrun the country represents the substitution of a danger, immigration in the case, for the real danger, which is the population and demographic collapse. And this real danger is something that cannot speak its name in these societies because it creates anxiety and it poses existential questions, existential issues for the sustainability, long-term sustainability of this society. So the first trend we should focus on, in my opinion, is demography, to see the impact of this demographic collapse on the democratic structures of the region, and in particular on the development of anti-liberal and anti-migration attitudes in the population. The second issue that I would like to mention, the second trend, is organized crime. Balkan countries constitute a hotbed for criminal organizations, and in particular for mafias, since the 90s. You all know the literature about the development of mafias. Mafias, they emerge in societies that are undergoing a late transition to the market economy, that lack a legal structure that protects property rights, and societies that have a supply of people trade in violence who become suddenly unemployed. This is the situation of the Balkans after the wars in the 90s and after civil unrest in Albania in the same historical juncture. But compared to the 90s, what has changed in the last years is the magnitude of this phenomenon. In particular, Albanian organized crime has become a global player. Albanian criminals were used to be seen as gangsters that operated under the control of biggest criminal networks. In the last years, Albania has become one of the top world producers of drugs, and in particular of cannabis. Dutch specialists have imported to Albania a genetically modified variety of cannabis, which is very productive, and this has helped Albania to become a very crucial player in the market of illegal drugs. And what is more, Albanian organizations have been able to penetrate the cocaine market. As you know, this is one of the most profitable markets in the world. And according to some estimates, illegal trafficking in Albania accounts for between 40 and 50% of the national GDP. And of course, all this liquidity has a big impact, a macroeconomic impact. Between 2017 and 2018, just to give you an example, the Albanian currency, the lek, appreciated dramatically. And this appreciation does not reflect the macroeconomic fundamentals of the country, but according to some European institutions, it reflects some unregistered transborder activities. So this means dirty money, a lot of dirty money that re-entered the country and that had an impact even on the exchange rate. So we can imagine the magnitude of this, the size of this phenomenon. But a big impact of organized crime, a big impact of this phenomenon is, of course, on the democratic development in the region. Organized crime alters the level playing field and contaminates democracy. It's clear. If your competitor has a lot of money, legal money, and use guns and use weapons and use force to fight politically you, it's clear that this creates a discrimination that alters the democratic, that change dramatically the democratic game. And then remember the lesson by Norberto Bobbio, this Italian philosopher. In a democracy, power must be visible. Visibility is needed in order to be accountable. If you don't know who does what, how can she or he be accountable to citizens? Secret organizations like mafia, like organized crime, invisible powers, to use Norberto Bobbio's concept, are incompatible with democracy. So organized crime in Albania, of course, but not just in Albania, because even in other countries of the region, we observe similar trends, has a big negative impact on the democratic development of the country. The third phenomenon which is impacting on the region is, and in particular on democracy in the region is, as I said, nationalism, defined as an exclusionary vision of nationality based on the opposition between friends and enemies. And nationalism in the region is still a very powerful tool. Look at the situation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina 25 years ago was built by the international community as a multinational country. 25 years after the signature of the Dayton Agreement, this multinational structure is under pressure, and there are very strong centrifugal forces from both Serb and Croatian nationalists. And these forces, they question the existence of a Bosnian multi-ethnic central state. So the main laboratory in the region of a multinational state is today under attack, and its durability is seriously questioned. Kosovo is still an open issue. The country, as you know, is not recognized by many states, including Russia and China. Ethnic tensions within the country are still high, in particular between the Albanians and the few Serbs that are still there. And there are many other examples of the importance of nationalism in the region. But I think that unlike the past, unlike the 90s, nationalism in the region has lost appeal as an active driver of mobilization. It's difficult to see today hundreds of thousands of young people taking the weapons and fighting for the future of one nation. They prefer moving to Germany. So migration is, demography plays really a crucial role. I mean, the potential of mobilization for ethno-nationalistic forces today in the region is limited. It's more limited than in the past. But nationalism plays a crucial role in the region as a political force, as domestic force to delimit the national political space. Hegemonic political parties use nationalism as a tool to reduce pluralism and to shape the party system. Hegemonic nationalistic parties in many countries, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, somehow even in Montenegro, they portray themselves as the only defenders of the national causes, of the national cause of the country, and therefore they question legitimacy of any other alternative within the same ethnic group. So they pretend to be the only representative of their ethnic group, and they deny legitimacy to any other alternative. And that's why they need nationalism. That's why they need to keep always a high ideological nationalistic temperature in the country, because they need it, because this is their existential raison d'être. This is their political tool to disqualify other opponents in the same political system. And of course, nationalism has negative impact on the value system of these societies. These societies, they're still fractured, they're still divided around national issues of the past, the Second World War, the wars in the 90s. In many parts of the Serbian society, there is no still there is no full acknowledgement of the genocide that happened in the region and that was perpetrated by some Serbs. So nationalism is there and is still a relevant political resource. The fourth dimension I would like the fourth trend that I would like to highlight is pluralism. Is a tendency towards a reduction of pluralism in the region. In the region, fundamental freedoms, including media freedoms, are under pressure. In 2014, the government of Albania presented a very aggressive anti-defamation package that was widely criticized, since it gave substantial power to the government to sanction media. But the most critical situation, in my opinion, is in Serbia. A Serbian NGO has registered more than 150 cases of attacks on journalists this year. Media are, in terms of ownership, they are in the hands of the state or of companies close to the Serb president Vučić. And the European Commission, in its last enlargement report, has mentioned the governing part overwhelming advantage and the promotion of government policies by most major media outlets as a critical issue. So we see that in these countries, the space for media pluralism is dramatically reducing, and media they're also increasing use as weapons. Fake news are systematically used to discredit political competitors. And this attack on pluralism is not limited only on media, but it also affects the rules of the electoral game. What we saw yesterday night in America with President Trump denouncing some irregularities, some frauds, he says some electoral frauds, is something that could have easily happened in a Western Balkan country, where the rules of the game, they're not part of a constitutional shared background, but they are systematically contested. They are systematically challenged. In Serbia, in Montenegro, in Albania, opposition parties have accused the government of unilaterally change the electoral rules in order to create an advantage for the majority. What is strange in the case of the US is that it's not the opposition criticizing, attacking the majority for electoral manipulation, but on the contrary, is the majority, is the president attacking the opposition for changing for manipulating the rules of the game. So these four elements: connection with organized crime, state capture, weak rule of law, nationalistic rhetorics, media control and tailoring of the rule of the electoral game are the main ingredients of the authoritarian shift in the region. This authoritarian acceleration is an endogenous process, fueled by authoritarian forces. It's the result of an authoritarian pressure by authoritarians, not by the mistakes of the local liberals. Liberal democracy in the Balkans is experiencing a defeat tout court, not a strange defeat driven by a betrayal of democracy by the Democrats. And the most remarkable example of this authoritarian acceleration is the establishment of a single-party regime in Serbia. The ruling party, SNS, is a splinter organization coming from the radical far-right nationalists. So they have nothing to do with liberal Democrats that never had any substantial and structural contact with Western forces. And this force is running the country since 2012. I would like to share with you some elements to assess the state of democracy in Serbia, and then we can see if this country is authoritarian, as I think, or maybe we can, perhaps we can discuss it. It's something else. Some researchers, they consider that Serbia is a competitive authoritarian system and not an authoritarian system. So let's see how competitive this system is. So following the boycott by the opposition of the last legislative elections, the majority party has gained more than 70% of the seats. And when you when you add the seats of the three forces of the majority, you obtain almost 100% of the seats of the national parliament. So the three forces of the majority in Serbia, they have obtained 100% of the seats in the parliament. The ruling party also governs all the 150 municipalities of the country, all the 23 cities and the 2 autonomous provinces. So all municipalities, they're run by the same party. You know, there is no outlier, there is no exception. I mean, in any local authority, even the smallest one in the country, there has been no case of dissent. There has been no case of an outsider being elected by the local community. No, in all local authorities, all 150 local authorities, it's the ruling party running the administration. So basically, they have 100% in parliament, and they have 100% in the local authorities. The ruling party also declares 750,000 members, which means that between 10 and 15% of the population of Serbia, including children, including babies, is a member of the party. Just to make a comparison, this is as if in Germany, I mean, if the CDU, if the main political party, German political party, had the same ratio of members amongst the citizens, the German Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, would declare 10 million members. Okay, so based on Serbian standards, the CDU should have 10 million members, while in reality it has currently 400,000 members. So there's something interesting. I mean, where when 10-15% of the population is member of a party. The party is highly personalized, and it's controlled by the President of the Republic, by Alexander Vučić. It has a structure which depends entirely on him. It's not the first time in history that a strong leader, that a strong autocratic leader needs a political structure. What is striking in the case of Serbia, and Serbia is the template even for other countries, is that even in a time of crisis of political organization, even in a time when it has become a commonplace, the idea that political parties as organizations are ebbing away, authoritarian regimes still need political parties. So Serbia tells us a lot about the importance of political parties as organizations able to manage the fight for power. Even in an authoritarian system, you need a political party. Even in a highly personalized system, you need a political party to control, to manage the fight for power, to control the many people that want to have an office, that are office ceiling. And this model, the model of the autocratic single-party regime, has been adopted not only in Serbia, but also in other political systems of the region, in particular by the hegemonic Bosnian Serb party and by the dominant Croat Bosnian party. So in the region, we clearly see the emergence of a political model, authoritarian political model structured around a single party regime, autocratic single party regime. The second case study I would like to mention is Albania. Albania also experiences a process of power concentration in the hands of the prime minister. But in my opinion, this country does not follow entirely the Serbian path. And I think that we need to focus on the effective balance of power within the country to understand its state of democracy. We have discussed the role of organized crime in that country, and we saw the importance of secret organizations, criminal secret organizations in that society. And in Albania, the important role, the crucial role of organized crime seems to narrow the democratic space. The balance of power, the balance of influence is increasingly determined outside the party system by other invisible forces. So we can suggest that in the Albanian political system, power is increasingly outside the already fragile democratic institutions, but somewhere else. And this reminds me of the concept somehow of the concept of post-democracy. I'm not saying that Albania is a democracy, but this idea of the displacement of the of power outside the formal institutions and towards new centers of power, it reminds me the idea of the post-democracy in the sense that in Albania, like in a post-democratic system, you have formal institutions that also try to be more democratic, if you want, in terms of design. But the power, but the substance is captured outside outside them. So I think that in order to better understand the relationship between, in order to better understand the evolution of democracy in the region, we also have to pay attention to the relationship between an extractive model of criminal capitalism and the informal dynamics of power in the region. So I think that you can see the democratic development, or I don't know if you can say development, democratic situation of the region is a very strong authoritarian push, and Serbia is the biggest example of this turn, of this authoritarian turn. But then also it's crucial to understand the relationship between new forms of capitalism and the informal dynamics of power, because the role of organized crime is really crucial in order to understand the development of this political regime. So, confronted with this scenario, confronted with this situation and with these challenges, what can the European Union do in order to support democracy in the region? And first of all, why the European Union? Why does the European Union have to support democracy in abroad? Why do we have to do that? I mean, one reason I already said is that when you look at the borders of the European Union, you see that the European Union is mostly bordered by non-democratic countries, and I'm very skeptical about the idea that we can transform Europe into an island. I mean, there are some common dynamics. But then the second reason has to do with enlargement policy. which is the main tool that the European Union has developed to cope with the Western Balkans. All the 6 countries of the region are candidates or potential candidates to join the European Union, as you know. And as you also know, enlargement is a political process. And since 1993, countries wishing to join the European Union must must be in conformity with some political requirements, being a democracy, a rule of law, respecting fundamental freedoms, including media freedom. So, confronted with the risk of a clear autocratization in the region, the challenge for the European Union is how to renew with the transformational power of the enlargement process. How to ensure that this political process is a real driver for democratic change in the region. And as I said, the Western Balkans has to be a democracy in order to enter the European Union. And in order to make this process more dynamic, more transformational, in 2020, the European Commission has reformed its methodology, so the way how a country progress is assessed, to give more importance to criteria related to the rule of law in particular, to the rule of law, which, as you know, is a pillar of democracy. And the 2020 Enlargement Commission reports have highlighted that in several countries, no progress was made in the last years with regard to the rule of law, to judiciary, and they also expressed some concern about the political situation and lack of pluralism in many of these countries. So the European Union, through the enlargement policy, has developed a normative power to influence democratic developments abroad. And this normative power, I think this is an important point, is based on a system of incentives and not of sanctions. So the European Union supports democratic political change nominally supports political and democratic change in these countries through a system of incentives. And the main incentive is accession, is the fact that if you behave properly, if you adapt to some democratic criteria, one day you will become a member of the European Union. You will become a member of the club, of the European club. So this is the main carrot, I would say. So we have carrots, but we don't have sticks. And when you deal with the autocratic, with the authoritarian regimes, sometimes the carrot, sometimes the incentive is not enough. But on the contrary, you need also some sanctions. And this is the difference, the main difference between America, between the US foreign policy, and Europe and the European Union. The European Union is proud of its civilian and not military role in foreign policy. But at the same time, we need to ask ourselves, we need to wonder whether the use of force cannot be, the threat of the use of force in some critical situations, including countries, political regimes that are becoming authoritarian. We need to wonder whether the threat of the use of force cannot be an effective tool to influence political process in these countries. We should never forget that stabilization, imperfect stabilization in the Balkans in the 90s, in Bosnia and in Kosovo, didn't happen through the politics and policies of incentives of the European Union, but through the use of military force, through America's interventionism in Bosnia and in Kosovo. So I think that one of the most daunting challenges for the European Union is to move from a system of incentives which are less and less effective in the region to a system of sanctions, from a cooperative approach to a more confrontational stance. What does it mean, a confrontational stance? What does it mean, a system of sanctions? I mean, well, it doesn't mean necessarily the use of force. It doesn't mean it. But it can also mean other forms of sanctions, financial, economic sanctions, for example. Even though I do believe that the issue of the tools, and in particular of the use of force, is posed to the European Union and to European countries if they want to be effective in stopping the authoritarian shift at the borders of the European Union. The European Union, apart from the enlarging policy, has also developed more, how can I say, granular tools, election observations, mediation and facilitation. So this means bringing together political leaders from the opposition and the majority, capacity building activities to strengthen parliaments in the region, and human rights activities. But in my opinion, along with the international pressure that you can put on the region through the enlargement policy, and not only, as I say, through the enlargement policy, also through more creative and I would say bolder tools, along with these international tools, the most crucial and most urgent action in the region is supporting, and that's what I'm doing now, that's what I do professionally, is supporting the actors of change. Like other political systems, the Western Balkans are experiencing a big crisis of representation. In countries such as Albania, less than 5% of the citizens, they trust the parliament, trust in politicians and in political parties is below 10%, not to say zero. Nowhere more than in the region, I have experienced a feeling of disconnection between the political establishment, which is often nationalistic, and their constituency, the citizens. And my conviction is that in order to stabilize the region, you need to work on the domestic political processes and try to recompose the fracture between citizens and elected officials. The system in many of these countries is currently blocked. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in 2 weeks, there will be local elections. And according to some estimates that I made, approximately 50% of the population, 50% of the potential voters are linked to political parties because they work in public administration, and patronage is a very potent, powerful tool to manage political electoral support, because they're members of political parties. You saw the numbers that I shared with you about Serbia. I mean, between 10 and 50% of the citizens, they're members of the main ruling political party. So the system is blocked and is able to perpetuate itself basically through patronage and clientelism. And so, if you want to unblock it, you need to support the actors of change. You need to act as people and organizations that are supporting effective change in the region. And how can you do that? Well, you can do that. First of all, you need to give visibility to these actors, because when you are visible, you are protected. When you are internationally visible, you are protected. If you are visible, internationally visible, it's less. It's probable, but it's less likely that militias, they will attack your house and they will put fire on it, as it happened to a journalist 1.5 years ago in Serbia. And then there is also a wide range of tools that you can provide with to actors of change in terms of capacity building. You can create a link with European political parties, and this is basically my function. And I think that and I think
Francesco, I think you are muted now.
Yes, I was saying that I think that the European Union cannot fail to support actors of change. I understand that the fear of change in these countries has some historical roots, and in particular there is the fear that change in the region could lead to new conflict, and that maybe perhaps it's better to freeze the situation in order to prevent any change, even for the worse. And Europe has not forgot the disaster of the Balkan Wars and the domestic local responsibilities for that. But I also think that the situation now has changed, that the Arab Spring in 2011 has taught us that authoritarian regimes don't prevent disruptive changes, but on the contrary, authoritarianism prepares the ground, creates the conditions for unrest and chaos, because blocked societies fuels they fuel frustration and resentment, in particular in the young generation. Blocked societies are factors of instability and not stability. And so I do believe that there is no alternative for the European Union than supporting change. I mean, it is difficult. It is complicated, in particular in a time when even Western European countries are experiencing a different but somehow similar process of democratic erosion. But I do think it is necessary, in particular in light of the strength of authoritarianism and authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, and this is the lesson that, in my opinion, comes to us from the borders of the European Union, has its own strength, has its own inner force. Sometimes it's not only the result of the mistakes, of the handicaps of Democrats, but has its own logics, its own powerful mechanics, and it's something very difficult to control. So these are some of the thoughts about the Western Balkans, and if there are questions or if there are issues, I will be happy to discuss them.
Thank you, Francesco. This was fascinating, a real tour de force. So I have a lot of questions, but I'd rather some of the other participants ask theirs first. Sophie, I saw that you were nodding, or does anybody else have questions that they want to raise? Please signal yourself to me, and I will. Yes, Sophie.
Thank you so much, Francesco. That was really, really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. So this may be a relatively controversial thing to say, but I'm not hugely convinced it would be great if you could convince me that the EU would be able to support the Western Balkans in forming democracy when they can't even control countries in the EU themselves from maintaining democracies, like Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland. So do you think they'll be able to support countries that aren't in the EU when they can't even support countries that are in the EU?
Well, I don't know if there are other questions, so if I can answer.
No, let's go one by one. We have the benefit, the only benefit.
No, I see your point, and it's a valid point. It's clearly a valid point, and I have to say that the European Parliament has been one of the institutions that called for the activation of sanctions against Hungary and Poland. So yes, there is a big issue, and it's a big issue of credibility for the European Union. You cannot support democracy outside your borders if you are unable to protect it within your borders. So your point is valid. But at the same time, I would like to point a fundamental difference between countries such as Hungary and Poland and countries like the Western Balkans. In my opinion, in Hungary and in Poland, the erosion of liberal democracy and the authoritarian shift, the clear authoritarian shift in these countries, has to do a lot with the mistakes of the liberal establishment in these countries, and in particular with the mistakes and with the choices taken during the transitional period in the 90s, in particular in terms of economic policies, but not only, also in terms of democratic governance. I do believe that the Western Balkans, they're not part of the same basket. Of course, they are all an indication of this trend of democratic backsliding that even the United States in these hours is experiencing. But I do believe in the case of the Western Balkans, we clearly see, as I said, the inner strength, the inner force of authoritarianism. And I'm not saying, I'm not saying this to minimize the responsibilities of liberals and of Democrats in these countries. Of course, even in these countries, even in the Western Balkans, in the 90s and in particular in the year 2000, there was a very weak, a very shy, very fragile transition to a kind of sort of democratic regime. So, of course, there were also responsibilities in this transition, and we should also ask ourselves about the responsibilities, let me say very frank, also of the European Union in this transitional process. But I think that the situation is different. I think that in these countries, we are really confronted with a clear authoritarian offensive, and this authoritarian offensive has its own autonomy that has something to do with, of course, the crisis of liberal democracies in the European Union, but has also its own roots and reasons.
Thank you.
David.
Yes, thank you very much, Francesco. I also thought it was incredibly interesting. I've actually two questions, and the first one is that indeed, if you look at authoritarianism in European countries, in the United States, there is a shift to it, but it's apparently supported by large parts of society. So in the Balkans, are all these authoritarian leaders, are they supported by the people to a similar degree as in the West? And does this alter the way in which the EU treats this issue? And second, all the factors we have discussed are all domestic issues. And I was wondering, and the EU is trying to do something about this, but are there also other powers, such as Russia or Turkey, who are active in the region with all their own interests?
Yeah, many thanks. In terms of support for the autocrats, for the authoritarian leaders of the region, it's difficult to say. Difficult to say that because if we pay attention, if we look at the electoral results, we see that they get 100%. The majority gets 100% in Serbia. I mean, but this is quite unlikely. So we don't have tools to monitor it. But my feeling is that there is some kind of support. There is some kind of support, and this support has to do with the value system that has been developed and that has been somehow also inherited from the 90s. I mean, I say that we don't have to, it's important not to have a static vision of the region and not to focus too much on the 90s. The region has changed. But it's also true that there has never been in the region a real revision of that experience, and in particular of what Friedrich Engels already almost many years ago defined as ethnic junk. I mean, there is an autocratic, ethnocentric discourse in the region, which is still there. Of course, it has changed the function, political function. As I said, it is mainly used today internally, domestically, to disqualify the opponents, to revindicate the centrality of the main national party, and to sideline other alternatives that are seen, that are labeled as unrepresentative of the true ethnic national spirit of the country. But you still have it. And I do believe that unless the region, and in particular some countries of the region, Serbia, and even Croatia, which is seen by many observers as the good student in the region, but still presents some critical issues in terms of narrative, nationalistic narrative. I do believe that if these countries are unable to overcome this rhetoric, I fear that this charismatic, autocratic template model of governance will fit at least one part of the population with their values and attitude. So there is a strong cultural work which is needed. And then there was another question, sorry, I see, about the international dimension.
Go ahead.
In my opinion, we have to be very cautious and we have to be very prudent when we discuss about the role of international forces in the region, in the Western Balkans. Because it is a commonplace to describe the region as an open field of competition between the European Union, America, Russia, and China. But to be honest, I think that in the case of America, we clearly see that there is a shrinking attention for the region. And if Joe Biden, I don't know if there are news about the polling processes in the US, but if Joe Biden is elected president, maybe something will change because Biden is an expert of the region. He knows the region. But so far, if I have to say the truth, there has been a clear disengagement of the US in the region. And even when you see Russia is not very active in the region. Of course, there is a historical connection due to the common religion, Orthodox religion, with Serbia. But my impression is that Russia is playing more a defensive role, is more on the backstage, ready to act, ready to intervene, but it's not playing a crucial role. I think it is more interesting to observe the Chinese position. China is massively investing in the region, is investing financially, but it's also investing politically. It's investing politically in terms of disinformation, in terms of propaganda, but let me say it's also investing in the region in terms of the cultural political models. And in particular, they're trying to sell the Chinese authoritarian model to the region. And it's quite interesting and puzzling, if I have to say, for a European, that one of the first countries, I think the first country in Europe, the first country in the West, not in Europe, which is experimenting facial recognition, a systematic structure of facial recognition in the capital is Serbia. And this system of facial recognition comes from China. It has been imported from China. So I see that China exerts a kind of cultural attraction in terms of political model, in terms of political template, I would say, even for countries in the region. I mean, you have the European model, of course, with its limits, but the consensual European model of democracy. And then I would say that in terms really of capacity transfer, in terms of imbrication, of interconnection of democratic and political systems, you do have China, which is present there as a regime, which is present with its people, which is present with its technologies, with political technologies to control the society. So I would pay attention to China in particular in the region.
Sure. If there's other people who want to ask questions, otherwise I'll go back to Sophie. Any other person, please signal yourself to me if you have a question. Sophie, do you mind if I take Pablo and then I'll come back to you? Pablo.
Thank you. And thank you, Francesco. This was really fascinating. I liked especially your point at the beginning, the framework, right? That the criticism you make, that critique of democratic narcissism, that even agonistic conception between sometimes it's not just the weakness of democracy, but the strength of the insurgency that explains a given state of affairs. But I wanted to ask you about, to me, a determinant fact of the crisis of democracy and the European crisis of democracy has to do also with the mere ideological level, with a certain blocking of the imagination, of the democratic imaginary, which is an essential tool for democratization too, right? Like the ideological capacity to appeal and seduce. And there seems to be, in the West, whatever that means, a certain lack of horizon of the democrat, a certain exhaustion. So I was wondering, I wanted to ask you whether you don't see that as an expression of a certain internal crisis. So the whole narrative we were reconstructing about, this kind of exaggeration of the internal incoherences or weaknesses of democratic liberalism, whether we are not at a historical point where actually that blocking of the liberal imagination tells you something about its current social and political strength. Then a very fast point about the frontier, because I like very much your point about the only way to understand this crisis is to think of what is happening outside. But I want to ask about whether the Balkans are really an outside, or whether its status, whether they are not on the other side of the border, but they are in some sort of sense, historically, the border itself. I was remembering a very punk text by Slavoj Žižek 20 years or something ago. I don't even want to think about it, but he had this text about, written from this perspective of Slovenia, obviously, about how the question of where do the Balkans begin, and how that boundary, depending on who was the speaker, was always the next guy, right? So it was a moving concept, certainly not a geographical one, which ended up obviously the question of the Ottoman Empire and, being a matter of religion. But then there is the relation of, to Greece, of all this. So it's kind of an ambiguous or a mixed space in a certain sense. And so it's kind of the other within in a certain sense. And then finally about Kosovo, just you are an expert on the area. I come from Spain. I've been part of parliamentary delegations in which, in European fora, in which just sitting next to the Kosovo delegation was perceived as a diplomatic outrage, and the Spanish delegation would, stand up and leave. Obviously, for internal political reasons. Spain didn't recognize Kosovo for fear of the precedent for the Catalan and the Basque question and so forth. But this is kind of a strong principle of Spanish diplomacy, for instance, like they will never go through that. And to what extent do you perceive that it's really like a blockade of that kind of fluency of the relation of democratization between Europe and the region as a whole? And again, congratulations. This was really, really excellent and really thought-provoking.
Thanks, grazie, Pablo, always inspiring what you say. Well, absolutely. I think the strength of democracy lies in its creativity, in its ability to rethink itself, but not just to rethink. I think this is also an organic process. I mean, it's bottom-up process. The fact that people, they find a way to innovate, they find some creative ways to innovate it and to make it stronger. And in particular, I think that now what we are experiencing a crucial dimension of the, I don't like the expression crisis of democracy, but okay, you understand what I mean. I mean, maybe my English is not sophisticated enough to articulate what I want to say, but let's say one of the aspects of the crisis of democracy is in particular the erosion of its representative functions. Is the fact that what I was telling before, that parties, they're not playing the representative game, but they play the power game, that parliaments are less and less representative, and of course, this is a challenge, the challenge of reinvent from below, if I want to say, representative democracy is really a daunting challenge for people doing democracy support, because it's clear that you cannot discuss, because of course we're not going to export anything, this is out of question, but you cannot discuss with interlocutors models of democracies that are already in crisis in your own political regime. So for me, for example, my role should be to try to develop parliamentary democracy in these countries. But then when I see the picture of parliaments and parliamentarism, not just parliament, parliamentarism as a concept in Western European political systems, I'm not at ease with this idea, with the idea of sharing this static model with other countries. So what I'm trying to do, for example, I'm trying to develop in these countries, I have a project in Bosnia on that, I'm trying to develop, for example, forms of deliberative democracy in these countries. You know deliberative democracy. Deliberative democracy, I'm very skeptical about deliberative democracy in Western European political systems, if I have to say the truth. What I don't like in deliberative democracy in particular is this consensual approach, is the idea that after through a meaningful discussion, you need an extensive discussion, you need to achieve a large majority and to find a common ground. But I do believe that democracy is also agonistic, is also based on conflict. So I don't see any problem, honestly, with conflict itself. And I think that one of the problems of Western European political systems is that they are less and less conflictual, if you want. So I do believe in conflict. I do believe in adversarial politics. But at the same time, when I see the situation in the Western Balkans, where we have a huge divide between the political class and the constituency and citizens, and where there is no agreement on the rules of the game, I see a big potential in this consensual characterization, in this consensual character of deliberative democracy. The fact of bringing randomly selected people together in a room and recognizing their representative role beyond elected politicians is a very strong political message that is sent to the establishment in these countries. Is the idea that institutions, foreign institutions, can support a kind of politics without politicians, because politicians in these countries are a problem, are a big problem. So this is one important dimension of deliberative democracy. For the Western Balkans, for example. A second dimension why deliberative democracy as experimentation, as an experiment can be important is the consensual character. Is the fact that in political systems where there is no agreement on the rule of the game, where there is no material constitution, and in some cases, there is no formal constitution. Bosnia is run by an international treaty, still run by international treaty imposed by the Americans 25 years ago. So where there is no constitution, where there is literally no constitution, I think that the idea of putting people together and develop a culture of consensus can play an important role. So I fully agree with your approach. And I think that the challenge is, yes, to try to use the Balkans as a little bit as a mirror for our democratic systems. And this idea of mirror applies very well, fits very well with the Balkans, because you said very well, the historic and culturally, Balkans are within and outside we are they blur borders. I mean, it's this idea of blurring borders which is the basis of the Balkans. Even Balkans, they don't mean anything. I mean, in Turk, Balkans means mountains. So these are mountains, you know. So somehow they are Europe. So they are within Europe, but they're also outside Europe. And that's why I like this idea of a mirror, of a deforming mirror somehow. It's Europe culturally, but it's also not Europe. It's Europe because it has always been part of the Habsburg Empire and of the Venetian Republic, but it's also not Europe because not exclusively Europe, because the legacy of the Ottoman Empire and has also some specific institutional and cultural issues that are not limited within the European imagination, if you want. So yes, we can use the Balkans for that. That's what I'm trying to do. I mean, I don't know if it is successful, but I'm trying to do that. I mean, I will, and on these issues, I will be happy to share with you, with the students, with the scholars, the link to a conference I'm organizing, the European Parliament is organizing. It's on parliaments and democratic innovations. Is this idea of creativity. So it's to try to map what's happening outside the parliament to strengthen the representative functions of elected assemblies, and to try to bring this experience together and to see if parliaments, if representative institutions can learn from these experiences. On Kosovo, well, Kosovo, it's quite interesting, the case of Kosovo, because Kosovo, unlike other countries of the region, Kosovo in the last months has become a battlefield between Europe and the US, between the European Union and Trump. Why? Because Trump basically wanted to get a quick fix for Kosovo, a kind of superficial deal to sell to his voters before in preparation for the presidential election. And so suddenly Trump, his family, his staff, they entered Kosovar politics. They contributed to change regime, to change the government, and to install an American-friendly cabinet. And because of that, there was a big tension, huge tension between the European Union and America. And in this case, in the case of the tension following the American intervention in Kosovo, you could see that Europe and the European Union was acting united. So, of course, there are different sensitivities, sorry. In particular, Spain, because of clear reasons, has always been vocal in its opposition to Kosovar self-determination. But at the same time, I see something moving. I see that in the diplomatic international game, countries like Spain, they are adopting a more cautious approach, because they do understand that in the region, I mean, I know that it can look very, I can say, it can look quite trivial what I'm saying, but it's the reality. In the region, when you are confronted with foreign powers, and in particular, I say with China, and in the case of Kosovo, with the US, when you are confronted with these players, you have to be united. You have to be united. You cannot have Germany, Italy, France, Spain vetoing, torpedoing agreements. You cannot have this. Because if you have it, then simply you don't exist in the diplomatic game. And this diplomatic game is done at the gates of Europe, even within Europe, as we said about the Balkans. So you really have to be united, I mean, if you want to be relevant in the game. And my feeling is that Spain is moving in this direction.
So I don't know if Regan or Francois want to ask a question, but I have Sophie and then I guess Francois, yes? Sophie, Francois, what about you, Regan? No, not for now. Okay, Sophie and Francois.
Francois, I think you were before me. I can wait if you like.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Oh, well, thank you so much, Francesco. It's extremely interesting and sobering. I had a question. You alluded to the possible use of force by the EU in the region. Could you elaborate a bit more? Do you have in mind the use of force by the military missions which are deployed, for instance, in Bosnia, or are you thinking of some anti-drug operation, something like that? Could you elaborate a bit? And I have another question. I was wondering to do a link with the immigration issue that you described. What is the role of the Balkan diaspora in Europe? Do they have any role in the countries, in their countries of origin? I mean, do they go back there? Do they vote at elections? Do they send money? Is there any activism which could be generated by these people, or have they just simply started a new life and they forget about the home country?
Thanks, Francois, for your remarks. So about the use of force. Well, I would say that this is more a self-reflection, and it's more at the theoretical level. I mean, what I'm thinking about, and it also comes from because I was reading the memories of some of the, let's say, main players of the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia, which took place 25 years ago, exactly 25 years ago, and in particular, how to make peace by Dick Holbrooke, and which is a masterpiece. I think that book is a masterpiece for America's diplomacy. And well, and what I already knew that, but what I understood, what I realized is that if America hadn't used massively armed force in the case of Bosnia, well, I fear that the European states and the European Union would have been unable to solve that mess, and the war would have lasted. At least this is the message coming from his memories, and I think that there is some truth behind that. I think that, I mean, this is a broader discussion, but as long as we were protected by the American interventionism, Europe could remove the issue of the use of force, the issue of the use of force as a political tool to deal with its opponents. We could remove it because we had the Americans, basically, because we had a backup solution somehow. And this backup solution, it played a role. It played a role in contemporary European history. I mean, in Bosnia, 70 kilometers from Trieste, in Trieste, in Italy, there is a say, and locals, they say that we have dinner in Trieste and then dessert in Bosnia. So it's really connected, you see. And 25 years ago, 20 years ago in Kosovo, is only thanks to the American military interventionism if the situation could be stabilized. And when I observe the situation in the Balkans, but also outside the Balkans, think of Putin in Ukraine, think of Erdogan in Cyprus, in Europe, in the European Union. I really believe that the issue of the use of force should be discussed. Then I don't have an answer. I'm not saying I don't have any strong normative position. I mean, I'm not saying that Europe should go back to, let's say, a Marshall approach. I have some doubts about that. I do believe in the normative strength of the European project. I do believe in the civilian power of the European Union. But we cannot remove that issue now that America has begun. We cannot remove it, because when we deal with an autocracy, that only as an autocracy, it doesn't recognize you as legitimate interlocutor, but it bases its approach to the distinction enemy-friend, and so it can also see you as an enemy. You need to question yourself and ask which kind of tools you can use in order to tackle your adversary. So this is more a theoretical question I was thinking about, but I think that it's very relevant in the case of the Balkans and in the case of our relations with these new authoritarian regimes. And then, of course, there is a very vast tools of offensive tools you can deploy. Economic sanctions, for example. We don't use proper economic sanctions in the European Union. I mean, America, even on that, Magnitsky Act, I mean, is with Russia is a much more ambitious tool to deal with sanctions. So my plea, my appeal is for a more assertive stance vis-à-vis autocracies in these countries. Then we can discuss how, but I think that this is a crucial issue that we need to discuss. Then I don't remember if there was a second question apart from use of force. Francois?
No, it was about the diaspora in Europe.
The diaspora.
And the connection with political life.
This is a very interesting question, because what I've noticed is that unlike other political systems, for example, Pakistan, for example, Bangladesh, Congo, RDC in Congo, where the diaspora plays a crucial political role, and there is clearly a connection between East London and Dhaka in terms of political developments. In the case of the Western Balkans, this connection is missing. Basically, you have a diaspora, you have in many cases even a very successful diaspora, but the links between the diaspora and the internal political dynamics in the countries are very, 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 very weak. And in my opinion, this is due to the fact that, as I said, I've never experienced, honestly, I have a little bit of experience in politics, such a level of isolation, such a level of isolation of the political establishment vis-à-vis their constituency, vis-à-vis their citizens. So it's clear that any attempt by the diaspora to enter in the political game in this country is stopped. It's stopped. It's stopped. Of course, there have been systematic efforts. They also created political parties for the diaspora, but nothing has been successful. We don't observe any structural linkage between the diaspora and the domestic political developments. And this confirms my idea, my urgency about the need for unblocking the political systems. You need to work on the internal political, more than on the international dimension, more than on international, rather than working on the international dimension, on international pressure. I think that you need to work domestically, internally on the political processes. You really have to try to unblock systems that are totally rigid and isolated vis-à-vis their constituents.
Sophie, if you don't mind, I'm sorry, because James has sent me a text with this chat and he has to go if he has a second, and then I'll come back to you, I promise. Then I have a question too, and we're beginning to run out of time. So let's have James, and then, sorry, Sophie, I promise I'll come back to you.
Sorry, Sophie, and hi, Francesco. Good to see you. It's been a while. I'm gonna put on my journalist hat, and like I can't avoid like not trying to connect what is going on today in the US with the election. And often we talk about the Balkans with like what America and what Europe can instruct the Balkans to do because we've got it all figured out. And it seems to me when it comes on questions of trust, the American people have very little trust in many American institutions, starting from their government, starting from their president, like calling the legitimacy of this election. So once again, American institutions will be tested, but like with what legitimacy does the West generally kind of is in a position to like instruct the Balkans first? And secondly, like, are there any parallels that you see the time that you've spent on the ground in the Balkans with what is going on here in terms of legitimacy, in terms of like trust in institutions, in terms of like a sentiment of complete breakdown of certain kind of basic democratic kind of tenets. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Well, of course, I mean, I see the comparison. Of course, America, the US is not the Balkans, but they're all part of a trend of, if you want to be diplomatic, you would say democratic erosion. That's what I write in my reports of the European Parliament, say democratic erosion. Then we can call it as authoritarian shift or authoritarian acceleration in some countries. The reality is that authoritarianism is winning. And this is what I have realized working on political systems that are outside the European Union. And this was not something I was aware when I was working on EU, on Western European politics. No, but if you look at the map of Europe, and you see that there is this exception with some stains, because you have Hungary, you have Poland, but then outside you have proper authoritarian regimes. Proper authoritarian regimes, because in Serbia, you have 15% of the population that are members of a party. This is typically authoritarian. Attack on media freedom. So, and what we don't have to really, but this is my message. I don't know if it's for you. That's my message for myself. That we really don't have to underestimate the force of authoritarianism. And in the American case also, I would say that we should be very careful, because these people, they keep strong. And we saw it yesterday night. They hold out. They don't leave. They don't say, okay, I acknowledge my defeat. They will never do that. They will be there. I'm not saying Trump particularly, but what Trump represents, what Trump embodies is there, and they will not give up. They will stay there. So of course that there are similarities. And I was discussing this with Carlo. I called it the Albanian scenario, because looking at seeing the president of the republic questioning the legitimacy of an election, and not only questioning the legitimacy of an election, denouncing frauds, electoral frauds in a country. Well, this is something that you observe in Albania. This is something that you observe in Serbia is a bit different, it's not fraud, but in Albania, this is the Albanian scenario. But so this means that the US, so it's the scenario of a country which is not a consolidated democracy, which is not a democracy, not just according to Francesco Ronchi, but according to all kinds of rankings, these Freedom House rankings, these economist rankings, it's not a democracy. So this means that this means that the US are deconsolidating its democracy. This is clear. At least this is the direction. Then I don't know what it will happen. No one knows that. But I think that what's happening today in the US is a clear signal, is a clear sign of a process of democratic deconsolidation. Then what will come after that? I have no clue. Will it be an authoritarian regime with a strong man? I don't know. Will it be a post-democratic regime where you have other forces, financial forces that decide? And then, of course, you have a dialectic, you have pluralism between Democrats, Republicans, but in the end, the game is decided outside, is decided somewhere else. This, I don't know. I'm unable, honestly, to spot a trend in particular in a country that I really don't know, but I clearly see some elements of democratic deconsolidation in the US, and I like this Albanian-American friendship a lot. Connection.
Great, thank you very much. Sophie, finally, sorry.
That's okay. Just a quick question. I've seen, obviously, I'm guessing this kind of democratic support from the EU is kind of grooming the Western Balkans to become part of the EU at some point, because I know they're on the waiting list. And I know that von der Leyen said that the Western Balkans were meant to be part of the EU, etc. And the EU's given the Balkans 3.3 billion euros in support during coronavirus. When do you think, personally, that they'll ever be ready to be part of the EU or they'll be accepted? Or is there a projection? Because it seems that people seem to be saying that they'll be joining at some point, but no one ever really seems to be affirmative about when it's going to happen or when they'll be prepped and ready for the EU.
Listen, Sophie, out of 6 countries in the region, only 2 countries, they're effectively negotiating their accession, and the negotiation process is lagging behind, okay? They're not closing chapters. This is a technical term to define it, you know? They are just discussing, but they're unable to close the chapters and so to go ahead. So I think that the enlargement process is in trouble. I think it's in trouble, unfortunately, if I have to be frank with you, not only, I would say, not because of the authoritarian shift of the region, but more because many European citizens, many European voters, they consider that the European Union's absorption capacity has come to an end, and in particular that we cannot absorb further foreigners, Albanian, Kosovars, Serbs, Bosnians. So public opinion is very skeptical. It's very skeptical. It's not. It's not open now to a further enlargement. So my feeling is that it will take time. It will take time, but we can use this time to characterize the enlargement in a different way. Because enlargement, in my opinion, is not an end in itself, honestly. Enlargement serves some purposes, and one of these purposes is democracy. Democracy as the embodiment of the principle of equality, as the fact that in a democratic system, basically I'm the same, I have the same rights and the same duties as the leader of the country, as the prime minister, you know. So that's for me democracy, you know, and that's why democracy is important. So if democracy, if the enlargement process serves these goals, it's very good. If the enlargement process doesn't serve these ambitious political goals, then the picture becomes more complicated, and I think that maybe it is also necessary to rediscuss the process in its nature.
Yeah, sure. We have about 5 more minutes. I want to ask a question, but go ahead, Sophie. Go.
Go first. I can wait.
No, go, Sophie.
I just wanted to ask if there's like any, obviously you mentioned there are other powers that are involved in the Western Balkans kind of trying to control and kind of reconstruct the political system they have in place already. Have you found personally that there are tensions between the role of the EU and between the role of, say, China and other countries at the ground level when you've been working with them or that kind of thing?
I think that with China, there are no tensions, honestly. I don't know where there are tensions with China. I mean, Chinese, I think it's a very smooth way of doing politics, you know. With America, yeah. With America, as I said, there were tensions, you know, really tensions. With Russian, there could be tensions. I mean, I never experienced it, but there could be tensions. But not with China. Not with, if you say really on the ground, you were saying, not with China. Chinese is very discreet power, you know. It's a power you don't see it, but you see the effects on the long term. And it's something important. I mean, von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, in her last State of the Union speech last September, mentioned the Balkans to say that the region cannot be just a step in the Silk Road. So that's the expression she used. She cannot be just. So this means that there is a clear strategy, Chinese strategy, to seduce and to integrate the region into their sphere of influence.
Regan?
Yeah, I have a quick question, but I just wonder if you have a sense that there could be a threshold where the longer the process of enlargement takes, the weaker kind of the promise or the benefit that appears to entering the EU, the less power that would have, that soft power, the less effect it would actually have on the Balkans. Do you think there's a point at which they kind of can't hold out any longer without bringing them into the EU and will have to shift to other tactics if they still want to promote democracy, obviously, before as a precondition to membership?
Membership is not, membership is not an obligation. European Union membership. I mean, you can, and we can question. I will not mention any name, but some observers, for example, they question the sincerity of the establishment of the ruling class in some countries, in some Balkan countries. I mean, in their ambition to become part of the European Union, you know. So I don't know if this is my position, but there is a big debate about that because it's unclear whether there is a clear commitment to enter the European Union in some countries of the Balkans, because of course being part of the European Union also implies some responsibilities and some obligations. We could also ask ourselves what would happen in countries like Poland if Poland was not part of the European Union. I mean, it's a way, I mean, I know it's a dialectical game a little bit, because we could also ask the opposite question. And so what the European Union is doing to prevent, has done to prevent what's happening in Poland and in Hungary. I mean, but we can also ask what would happen in these countries if they weren't part of the European Union. So there are obligations, there are limitations, and I'm not sure whether the ruling class of these countries is able to accept them.
Francesco, I can see that, I know that it's 10 o'clock there for you, and that you've given us a lot. You and I can have a conversation, so I don't know, I have a temptation to say it's been really interesting. I don't want to push, I have a list of questions, but...
One question.
Okay, well, thank you then. Okay, thank you. I wanted to unpack a little bit this concept of authoritarianism that you use, and that you drew this distinction between like an internal endogenous crisis of democracy and then an external threat coming from this inner force of authoritarianism. You want to talk about authoritarianism as a thing. And I wanted to ask, what is authoritarianism? Because as far as I understand, authoritarianism is a residual category that nobody calls themselves authoritarian. Usually democracies calls whatever is not democracy authoritarian, and it has the same strategy as totalitarianism. Like it's about uniting the left and the right. Like you can be China or supposedly on the left or whatever, and Russia, nationalist. So what is authoritarianism about? Like, how do they describe themselves? I don't think that authority is a means, not an end. So what is the project? What, like, usually if you ask like Russia, the Soviet Union was called an authoritarian regime. They didn't think of themselves as an authoritarian regime. They thought of themselves as a Soviet regime. So I was interested in understanding what is authoritarianism if it has an inner force. What is authoritarianism about? What is its teleology? What is its substance? I know it's a big question, and you have 2 minutes.
No, I want to say that first of all, that I do accept I do like the residual nature of authoritarianism, and this is for me the most important. Then I will also add a substantial part. It's not an escape strategy, but for me it's important, this residual nature, in the sense that it's important to say that first of all, these countries, they're not democratic. They're not democratic, okay? And this is the most important thing that I have to say. I'm saying this because, and when I say non-democratic, I do adopt, goodbye to David. I do adopt a very minimalistic definition of democracy, which is basically, okay, competition, a fair competition, Schumpeter, okay? Schumpeter and a little bit popular, okay? You can change government in a peaceful way. You can change authorities in a peaceful way, okay? So it's the competitive element, the fact that you have fair competition. And my understanding is that in these countries, and I mentioned some examples, you don't have fair competition, because in particular, because of media control, which is crucial. And the problem is that what you observe, even at the level of policy making in the European Union, is that the most popular concept which is used in the European Union, in the European institution, is the concept of competitive authoritarianism. Competitive authoritarianism. So if you see the presentation that take place in the European Union, in the European Commission, you have researchers, they come. There is really there is a field, you know, there is an intellectual investment, and it's very interesting. And they come here and they say, Serbia, we are very worried about Serbia because it is a competitive authoritarian system. But if it is competitive, this also means that it's not that authoritarian. So they play with this oxymoron, and they always play with this oxymoron in the case of authoritarian regimes. So it's not, they say, for example, we never, it's hard to see people that say in the case, for example, of the US, that the US is, I cannot say, an authoritarian democratic regime, that they play with this oxymoron. No, they only do that they only do that for authoritarian regime, to smoothen it a little bit, to make it more acceptable, if you want, in terms of policy making. Because if I'm working in a system which is competitive, okay, come on, it's a bit authoritarian, but I can work on it. So it's only in the case of authoritarian regime. So I do accept the residual character. And that's why at the beginning, that's why when I was describing the map of Europe, I say that Europe is mostly bordered mostly by non-democratic countries, and I didn't want to enter into the discussion. But at the same time, I also see some characteristics. I mean, some substantial characteristics in this regime. The first one is a clear rejection of pluralism. They don't like pluralism. Look at the case of Serbia. In the case of Serbia, this is striking. In the case of Serbia, there were three parties that were elected in the last parliament, okay? The opposition boycotted the election, and there were three parties. One party was, let's say, not a political, but it was, let's say, civic list, which has a history of independence vis-à-vis the ruling party. But the ruling party decided to incorporate this third movement, this third party, into the majority in order to get 100%. I mean, without that party, without that third political organization, they would have gotten, I don't know, 85%. So there was no problem for the majority. But they wanted to have 100%. They want to have 100% of the local authorities. What is the reason to have 100% of the local authorities? I mean, 100%, I mean, it doesn't make serious, you know, it doesn't make, you could have a cosmetic 90%, you know, to show. So they really don't like pluralism. They don't like pluralism, and I would say that maybe it's also diversity, which is a pre-existing concept than pluralism, but they don't like pluralism. So I see very strong rejection of pluralism. I see second element, a huge tendency towards power concentration. There is a man, and the man decides everything, and the man is not accountable to anyone, and this is autocracy, Then we can decide the name. We can call it, I don't know if we have to go back to Linz, I don't know if we have to, you know, there is big debate. I also liked this book about despotism, which was written by this Australian scholar, you know, and I think it's good. I mean, but I'm not interested in this, for my work, I'm not interested in this discussion. I'm more interested in the substantial dynamics behind that, and these dynamics, they're clearly non-democratic. I mean.
Francesco, thank you very much. This was fantastic. All the people who have been leaving have been telling me this was a really great talk. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm sorry that I scheduled it at a moment that was not ideal. And but thank you everybody for being here. And I guess I'll announce that. And next one is Esther McVeigh, who we're going to have thanks to Sophie, a sitting member of the British cabinet. So I'll stay tuned and we'll tell you the dates and information about that. Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Regan. Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to leave the meeting now. So thank you.
Many thanks, and good luck with the American.
Thank you, Carlo.
Ciao.
Bye-bye. Thank you.